Good evening. I'm giving us a little extra time because we've got some people in the hallway, but I think we're settling in now. And it's really good to see a mix of students and faculty and community people here. That's really what Tocqueville aims for, that kind of, cross-pollination, between the various firming communities. So we're glad you all are here. I want to welcome you to the third and final Tocqueville event of the fall semester. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. I hope you received one of those colorful brochures at the door. It contains the schedule of topics and speakers for the year. You may want to peek at next semester's events. You will see we have just as enticing a set of topics and speakers next semester as we have had this semester. For those of you not familiar with the Tocqueville Center, we ask the big questions at the heart of political, economic, and social life in America. We are interested in what Alexis de Tocqueville was interested in when he toured the newly minted United States of America way back in 1831. If any of you have read his famous book, Democracy in America, you will know that this French aristocrat was interested in almost everything under the sun, which gives us great freedom to explore topics that were relevant in his day and now in ours. Tocqueville spent only a small portion of his American tour in the southern states, including South Carolina, by the way, where he visited Columbia on his way back to New York, heading back home to France. But while he was in the South, he observed America's peculiar institution of slavery and came away profoundly discouraged. He was convinced of two things: that slavery would eventually end, probably after a race war, and that slavery's effects on Black Americans would run deep and last for many generations. Tocqueville was half right on his first prediction. We did get a war, not a race war, but we got a war. But he was entirely correct on the second. The end of slavery did not end the suffering of slavery. The Black experience in America is complicated. The Tocqueville Center is committed to exploring that experience from many different angles. And this week, we are privileged to have with us one of the prominent voices in this discussion, Esau McCaulley. Tonight, Professor McCaulley will share insights from his own experience as a Black man from the South. Tomorrow night, we will focus this experience through the prism of American patriotism, but more on that at the end of tonight's discussion. Before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you how we will proceed this evening. First, Professor McCaulley will speak. We will then bring up a response panel to discuss Esau's talk. And finally, we will open to questions from the floor. So store up your questions for the Q&A. Now to our speaker. Esau McCaulley is an author, active clergy person, and the Jonathan Blanchard Associate Professor of New Testament and Public Theology at Wheaton College in Illinois. Full disclosure, my alma mater, and I'm very proud of tonight because I can finally bring a professor from my school and my wife's school to Furman. So this is a proud moment for me. And I did spend a lot of time in Blanchard Hall, where you don't spend a lot of time, but you are the professor, Jonathan Blanchard professor. Esau earned a BA from the University of the South, an MDiv from Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, a Master of Sacred Theology from Nashotah House, and a PhD in New Testament from the University of St. Andrews. His research and writing focus on New Testament exegesis, African American biblical interpretation, and public theology. He has authored numerous books and articles, including his best-selling Reading While Black, which I have a display copy right here. The subtitle is African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope, which won numerous awards, including Christianity Today's Book of the Year. He is also a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and his writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Christianity Today. His most recent book is How Far to the Promised Land? One Black Family's Story of Hope and Survival in the American South. His talk tonight will draw on this memoir. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Esau McCaulley.
I was telling some of the people that Furman actually appears hidden in How Far to the Promised Land, because in that story I recount being recruited as a football player. And interestingly enough, I was recruited as a football player until I tore 3 ligaments in my knee, at which time Furman stopped recruiting me. And I said, it would be great if I ever found that coach again. And lo and behold, the head coach of Furman was recruiting North Alabama during that time. So I forgive you, coach. This is the moment of reconciliation. I was like, what are the chances that coach is still here? He rose to power, so apparently he made the right decision. He knew who to recruit, who not to recruit. But anyways, all is well, all is well. But I was like, he looked familiar too, but it couldn't be him, it's him. Okay. That being said, I was thrown off by that. It's just like my past jumped out at me. And it wasn't just him, by the way. There was a bunch of other coaches who did it. They underestimated my ability to recover. But nonetheless, I'm not here to relive my old football grievances. I am here, supposedly, to speak to you all about my memoir. Now, usually when I travel the country, I speak about topics like equity and justice and peace. Any of them could be the subject of an erudite lecture. I could define my terms, cite scholars, and wax eloquent about the nature of these democratic ideas, or defend them against their detractors. We live in a time when any discussion of justice is met with skepticism or slander. The world is complicated, and I could dive headlong into that complication. And that's what we're taught to do in the academy. We impress people with our acumen, even if we're unintelligible. But I'm not going to do that today. And I've not been doing that for the last few years, and I'm going to tell you why. I was in the midst of my doctoral studies, and they have these workshops when you get towards the end of them where they tell you how to get a job and how to succeed in life. And I was sitting in a room something like this with about 10 or 15 other people, and they started offering us advice. The first one was, stay offline, get off the internet. Do the technical, boring work. Do nothing popular. Be taken seriously. Get tenure. And then you can do and say what you want. But there was a problem. The year was 2016. And I felt like the people in my neighborhood who grew up where I grew up didn't need someone with tenure. They needed someone that they could reach. They needed someone who could tell the world what's happening and make people pay attention. So I ignored that advice and did the opposite. I started writing a blog, and from there I started writing for Christian outlets. From there, The Atlantic, and from there, then the New York Times. And I also began writing a book, it's actually here, called Reading While Black, where I tried to explain to people how the black church had been a force for equity, justice, and peace. It was precisely this faith, nourished in the heart of the black church, that helped me become more than just a jumble of grievances. It gave me the strength to hope. More about that later. I returned to that same subject or topics in my 5th book, How Far to the Promised Land. You guys brought me props. But rather than make arguments about the nature of justice, I told the story of my family over the course of 4 generations of the McCaulleys on one side and Bones on the other, mostly taking place in Alabama and Tennessee. Why listen to the stories of my family over any other? For one thing, I think that there are experiences that are common to humanity, that all of us endure. Families, with all their dysfunctions, in some ways contain the world entire. Everybody knows what it's like to have a sister or a brother who gets on your nerves, or a mom or a dad who disappoints you. But more than that, poor Southern black families have a unique and important perspective. One of the things I learned is that money can be a great curtain that we can drop over suffering. If you don't want to see the poor, you can simply move away. Or there's someone in your neighborhood who looks suspicious, you can call the police and send them off. But the poor don't have that luxury. We grew up in the midst of it. We see the entire thing. And more importantly, black families can't opt out of being black. Our racial identity and the animus that it stirs out in the populace leaps up at us at unexpected moments. And all of a sudden, we're just reminded that we're black in America. Black goes in style and out of style. We're in season, we're out of season. But through all of that, we're always who we are. So black stories I want to suggest, especially the stories of poor black families, insomuch as they are black and they are true, reveals America for what it is, because we can't hide from any of it. But there's another reason I like telling stories, and it's because I'm a Christian clergy person. We take a look at the phenomenon of the Bible, we see that God seems to be stubbornly committed to telling stories. Even the book that we think of as the law, the Torah, contains extensive narratives, focusing on the stories of Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph. The Bible, which shapes the imagination of the people of God, of the Christians at least, are largely poetry, story, and song. So why does God give us so many stories? I think that's actually the defining human quest. The struggle to find out what kind of story do I live in, to answer this question. What kind of world do I inhabit? Who's in charge here? Do the events that happen to me have any larger meaning than the fact that they're the latest thing that has happened in a topsy-turvy world? Making sense of stories, in that sense, are a way of making sense of God. And it's important that I insert God here in the midst of this story because I think of my one of my literary heroes who I respect, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. He tells his son that there is no God. There's only the struggle itself, and that impacts how he thinks about race in America. And because I believe there is a God who governs the universe, we might come to different conclusions, even though we hopefully respect one another. He probably has no idea who I am, but that's neither here nor there. But my faith informs how I think about the American story. And for me, Christ stands at the center of that story. And he reveals to me what the story is going to look like. Because Christ is, for the Christian, a bloody champion. That means that our stories, like history itself, are cruciformed, patterned after the cross. That means that every truly human story will have its heartbreak before it gives way to beauty. For the Christian, if you live long enough, there is no laughter without a hint of pain. So why then tell a story instead of writing more boring books? We need individual stories, just like we need arguments, because narratives are entry points into the wider account of what God is up to in the world. So with all of that throat clearing, let me say a little bit about how far to the promised land, then I'll sit down. What is my story about? The language of promised land probably conveys to you the idea of the Exodus. But one of the things you might be surprised to learn is that us writers only get so much say in the titles of our books. And sometimes we are vetoed by our publishers. I wanted to call the book The Vine and the Fig Tree, but they thought that was too cute. And it actually comes from, the themes of the book comes from this passage from the book of Micah, where it says, I think it's a familiar passage. It says, They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up war against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. In this passage, he talks about the prophet Micah looks to this day. Micah was also a favorite book of Martin Luther King. And the prophet Micah looks to this day where God's going to show up and Israel's long period of suffering will end. And everybody in Israel will have a home, their own place, under their own vine and fig tree. They have peace. So the promised land refers to this place of safety. And how far to the promised land is the story of my family's search for safety and peace, in a place where there will be no one to make them afraid. And in America, there are often numerous times where black people feel a little bit less than safe and far from any vine or fig tree. My journey to telling my family story began in 2017. I got a phone call in the middle of the night from my sister. She was weeping, and she told me that my father had died in a single-car accident in California. He was a truck driver, and his truck veered off the overpass down to the bottom of the overpass below, and he died upon impact. And my father hadn't been a part of our family growing up. He struggled with addiction. But nonetheless, it quickly became clear that as the clergy person in my family, I would be tasked with the job of giving the eulogy. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you have never given a eulogy. But a eulogy is an attempt to tell the story of someone's life. And so you sit down with the person's friends and their families, and you say, tell me about this person. Explain to me who they are so I can make sense of their life. But it's not just the act of telling that person's life. As a clergy person, you're tasked with telling that person's life in the context of the wider purposes of God. And so I sat down with my mom and my aunts and my uncles and my grandparents to learn about my father. And the journey to get to know him sent me on a journey to get to know myself, because it's impossible to understand his story without understanding my own. And what began is research into his life, maybe because I'm a scholar, we don't know when to stop. It went deeper and deeper and deeper into my family's history. And so I began to not try to just make sense of his life, but make sense of my family's life in the context of the United States. So how about to the promised land then is for people whose journey towards peace and healing, and even a God, involves this journey through the familial trauma. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to talk about familial trauma. I'm going to talk about anti-black racism, and then I'm going to talk about complicated beauty, and then I'll sit down. That was a note telling me to take my daughter to singing lessons. That's what happens if you don't turn off the notifications. My earliest memories of my father were of his addiction to drugs. I remember when I was 8 or 9 years old, I had this Transformer sleeping bag that glue in the dark, and that's what I would sleep in. And he came home, and he was screaming, and so I snuck all the way down into the bottom of that sleeping bag. What Optimus Prime was at the center of it, kind of radiating that green light that you get in the dark, and I thought the Optimus would keep me safe. But I heard this crash, and so my concern for my mom and my siblings took me out of my sleeping bag and into the hall. And I saw that my father had punched a hole in the wall, and he was yelling at my mom, who was on the other side of the bedroom door, and it was locked. And she was saying, Esau, Esau, get out of here, before the police came. And I remember praying to God that the police actually would come. And they did. And that was mostly my childhood. He would come and he would go. He would come and he would go. And eventually, that diminished, and the violence gave way to something a little bit more kind of sad and depressing. Just a man who was addicted to drugs. And because of that, he missed the key events in my life. And his departure sent our family tumbling down the economic ladder. I never forget when we first walked into a church. We went to a church we'd never been before, and it wasn't a Sunday. And I remember asking, why are we here? And on the inside, they had set up this grocery store for people to get food. And I realized that we could no longer afford to feed ourselves. And I also remember we would be driving home, and you span through the radio stations during this time, and you'd have like the talk radio people. And it'd be people like Rush Limbaugh who would talk about the welfare queens and call us lazy. And I was like, that's my mom. I know that she works every day. It's hard to sometimes talk about these stories because they can feel like a trope. The idea that as an African American, I was negatively impacted by the absence of my father. And we could talk about the need for peace and healing and justice and all of these things out in society. But it's also true that sometimes we are traumatized by the people who are closest to us. They wound us, and they expose us to the realities of what happens when you don't have the economic and social and cultural support. And here I'm comforted a little bit by the story of Joseph in the Bible. He's the one guy who gets to have movies in the Bible. Joseph's in the Technicolor suit and Prince of Egypt, all of Joseph, right? One of the things I often missed out in this story is that Joseph's story is actually the story of family trauma. He is someone whose entire adulthood was shaped by the betrayal of those who are closest to him. And despite the fact that that's a central part of Joseph's story, he doesn't really talk about his family very much at all. As a matter of fact, when they asked Joseph about how he wound up in prison, he only says this: I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing wrong. He speaks about his innocence, but not the betrayal of those who loved him. See, Joseph had to figure out his life in the world and the question of God in the context of familial betrayal. And how did he manage not to lose himself in this? How did he manage not to lose hope in the context of extreme familial suffering? He talks about it. It says in the book of Genesis, the Lord was with him. Why was Joseph able to survive? The presence of God. One of the things that might surprise someone who wonders about what it's like to be a kid who's dealing with domestic abuse is the fact that I never actually had a religious crisis during this time. I always knew that God was there. I was frustrated He didn't help us, but when I got on my knees to pray, I felt the presence of God. One of the fancy things that happens is when you get to college, places like this with great buildings and stuff, they give you amazing books. I remember when I arrived and I began to read all of these intellectual critiques. I read about secular humanism. I found out about David Hume and all of the people of the Enlightenment, and that was great. But David Hume wasn't there in that bedroom with me. God was. And he was there, and he was my friend. I remember when I was doing my PhD at the University of St. Andrews, and they had a debate. And they had these two, I think it was a Scottish and a British guy. If you want to see a debate off, the language itself was like, it was amazing. It was just like listening to them talk. But anyways, they're debating the existence of God. The British guy and the Scottish guy, one was an atheist, one was a Christian. And at some point, they turned to the question of suffering. And they brought up malaria. I don't know why it was malaria, but it was malaria in Africa. They talked about the suffering of innocent Africans. And I remember being the only black person in the room. And I was tempted to go, do we get a vote? Because I think that the people who have suffered have the right to determine the meaning of that suffering. And God, that's what many African Americans might say, was there in the midst of very difficult circumstances. Now, my journey towards God and how far to the promised land doesn't simply involve familial trauma. It also involves anti-black racism. One of the interesting things that when you travel around the different parts of the United States is different parts of the conversation when people get off the train. Some people are here for the family part, but when the race part comes, they go, oh no, they buckle down. Like, what are you going to say? Because there are certain stories that we're not allowed to tell, that the guards come up, and there's a refusal of empathy. Because if the stories that I tell are true, it begins to challenge certain narratives of America. As I began to talk to my grandfather about his family history, he told me that he grew up as a tenant farmer. Him and his family worked for a guy named Reuben Miller. Now, Reuben Miller rented out land to my grandfather's family, and from the small portion of income that he received, they had to pay for their feed, pay for all of the supplies, and clothe and feed themselves. No matter how good the crop was, at the end of the year, Reuben Miller would say to my grandfather's family, you just broke even. He started picking cotton at the age of 4 years old. And they had to pull my grandfather out of school during harvest time so that he could help his family. And Reuben Miller's family, who had also children my grandfather's age, were fed off my grandfather's labor beginning at the age of 4. He talks about what it was like to drive past the white school to the colored school. That's what his language. And they would have to put coal to heat the furnace before they could start the school so they wouldn't freeze. They were cold in the morning and sweating by the end of the day. They were never actually completely comfortable. And because of his work, picking that cotton, and the school that he missed, even though he was a straight-A student, my father was near a grown man by the time he began high school. He had to drop out. His undereducation was a direct result of the economic exploitation of Reuben Miller's family, and that family was fed and clothed and educated by my grandfather's labor at the age of 4. This is not ancient American history. My grandfather's alive right now. And we all know, the best predictor of one's education is the education of one's parents. I remember when I was in college and they told us about Brown versus Board of Education. And there's this famous picture. Have you all seen it of the kid holding the newspaper with the mom and the daughter? And so I asked my grandfather, I said, Grandfather, what was it like when Brown versus Board of Education passed? Did you celebrate? He says, we didn't have a newspaper. And so I missed that day. We have this idea that these events happen and then history is changed. After Brown versus Board of Education, massive resistance occurred in my hometown, and they wouldn't have their first integrated schools until 1963. My Aunt Vanessa began in segregated school. My mom was the first one to begin school all the way through in schools that were actually integrated. But one of the things that's really interesting, if you sit down and you talk with her, is what is it actually like to be a black kid in an integrated school when no one wants you there? She told me about her name. Her name is Lori. And they were going through the attendance. And there was a white girl at the school named Laura in the same class. And the white teacher said to my mom, I don't want to have two different names. She's going to go by the white kid's name. And they went to school together all the way through. And my mom began to get used to being called by the white girl's name. It wasn't until she got to middle school where she gets her first black teacher. And the black teacher's going through the attendance, and they call my mom's name Lori. Mom goes, no, my name's Laura. And the black teacher says to her, it says here. She was the other teacher that told me, And it was the black teacher who actually gave my mom her name back. She talks about what it was like to do well in school but not be invited into any of the honor societies, or not to even know what it was like, what it meant to apply to college. And so because my mom was largely ignored by a somewhat hostile Southern educational system, she also doesn't go to college. I am the first generation, my sister actually, who's 2 years older than me, was the first McCaulley to graduate from college. And my daughter and my children here are the first McCaulleys or Bones to be raised by parents with college education. My grandparents and my mom were directly impacted by Jim Crow. It was when I was in high school, not being recruited by Furman. Sorry, that's not even true. It was a couple years before that. I just can't resist. I never had this moment. I felt so much power. I think I was somewhere in middle school, actually, when the Rodney King incident happened. And, like, for y'all young people who don't understand, like, there's these things called video cameras. I don't know how to describe it to a young person. Just imagine, like, they take a piece of your phone and make it big and unwieldy. That's what it was, right? And through a series of circumstances, this thing that we think of as very common, videotape evidence of anti-black police violence, we saw it. And for us, this thing that was recorded on this grainy videotape was this one moment where we thought it was going to change everything because America finally saw what was happening to black people. What was George Floyd for you all was Rodney King for us. I could not drive at the time, but Mom sat me down, and she gave me the rules of driving in the Black South. Places you couldn't go, things you couldn't do, don't speed, don't break any of the, and she made me promise her, in the 6th, 7th, 8th grade, that I would do it. And I said yes, but I was a teen, and so I often broke those rules. I remember one time there was this football game. I was at college at this point. There was this football game that I wanted to watch the end of. It was Sunday night football or whatever, or maybe it was Monday night. But I stayed to watch the end of the game. One of the things is you don't drive through small southern towns late at night. I was going from Huntsville up to Suwanee. I said, Mom, I'm going to stay and watch the game. I'll drive home with my friend. It'll be fine. So I watched the game, and we were driving up from Alabama to Suwanee, Tennessee. If you've never been to Suwanee, just imagine the middle of nowhere, go 20 minutes further, and you're close to that. And so we're driving near in these backwoods, in these small towns, it's up this mountain. And all of a sudden, a police car pulls out behind me and my friend. And we get that feeling in the pit of your stomach, oh no, there's police, and we're in the middle of nowhere. And so I follow my mom's rules. I get my hand at, 2 and 12, whatever it is. And I knew there were speed traps up here, so I knew that he thought that I didn't know that. So when the speed trap came, I slowed down. And then there was these lights that came on, the police lights. And he pulls me over. And I forget, I said, sir, because you always say sir, you're Southerners. Like, was there a problem? And he said, yes. You had a sudden change in speed. I said to him, well, there's a speed trap there. It's why I changed speeds. That didn't seem to satisfy him. He asked us where we were going. We told him we were going back to the University of the South. Suwanee's one of the top 25 academic schools in the country, at least it was at the time. He did not believe there were 2 black boys who were actually going to Suwanee. So he asked to see our student IDs, both of our licenses. Anyone who knows anything about law actually knows that those 2 requests are illegal. We were in the middle of nowhere, somewhere between Alabama and Tennessee, so we complied. He took our licenses and he went to his car and he came back. He hands them back to us. And he says to us, you boys, go straight up to that mountain and don't stop anywhere else. And I remember the word boy felt like a challenge. And I was having a good day that day, and so I had self-control. But one of the things that caused me to leave my beloved South is that I was not sure how many days I could have before one of their bad days, actually one of my bad days, we had a tragedy. See, the thing about being black and Southern in America is that you can't have that. You got to follow the rules. The day before I left for Suwanee College that I would be at for 4 years, I had run into, actually a few days before that, I run into a friend of mine named Jesse McCaulley. He was actually going to go up to Middle Tennessee State University, and I was going to go to Swanee. We'd be like an hour and a half away from each other. We had seen each other at the Black Arts Festival, and he said to me, hey, man, we should connect when we get there. I said, sure, man, we'll connect. The morning I'm getting ready to leave, I am eating that. We had off-brand cereal. We were broke. So it was like whatever the fake Fruit Loops were, that's what I was eating. And I looked on the television, and I saw Jesse's picture on the television. And the night before we were both to go to college, we found out we were leaving on the same day. The night before we were going to college, I was going to Swanee. He was going to MTSU. Jesse had been shot and killed. Jesse was saying goodbye to his girlfriend, much like I did the night before. And someone had come up to Jesse and asked him for his rims on his car. And he hadn't said yes quick enough. And in the panic, they shot him. And he died. Only child. His mom actually becomes an advocate for gun violence because she talks about how there were 3 boys whose lives were taken that day, Jesse's, and those 2 boys who went to jail for the rest of their lives, and then a life of crime after that. And she talks about how she wanted to get those guns out of our communities. And what I want to talk about, what I wanted to wrestle with in How Far to the Promised Land is that both of those things were real in the South, right? There was the violence that marked my community as a manifestation of economic nihilism. But there was also anti-black racism. And these things don't like send you an agenda at the beginning of the day. Like you're gonna have to have a racial incident and a violent incident, and then you're gonna be broke. Like it pops out at you at any moment. And to make sense of what it meant for me to be black in America, meant to be honest about all of those things. And I became very frustrated with people who wanted me to tell one part of that story, not the only part of that story. I left Huntsville thinking that I was responsible to tell the truth for Jesse and all the people who never got to leave my neighborhood. I said to myself, if I ever get there, I'm going to tell the entire truth and not just part of it. I arrived on the campus at Swanee, an all-white school. It was football. I was a football player, Division III. And we were there early because it was time for camp. So some of the other football players was there. And I remember walking up the stairs in Tresvant Hall, and there was a guy who had his door, but it was hot. We didn't have air conditioning, so it was open. And there was a huge Confederate flag. Like it took up the whole wall. And I had my bag in my hand. I'm thinking about Jesse. And I look at that flag, and I look at him, and it was clear that he had never expected to see a black person. And he didn't know what to do. What I've often thought about those juxtapositions of Jesse and the flag. Anti-black racism, the violence that marks our community, those violence linked to the economic flight that sent my neighborhood down the ladder where the jobs left and there was nothing there. What does justice look like for my family? What does repair look like? But that might be too limited of a question because I'm a theologian. The question is, where is God in the midst of all of this? And I am running low on time, so I'll just say that I concluded, after a lot of reading and thinking, that I valued the presence of God in my life because he gave me tools that critique both me and the society that I lived in. That he could tell me what was broken about the world out there and the brokenness that existed in here. That Jesus, who himself was shaped by Israel's prophets, gave me a picture of both justice and holiness that could compel me forward. They could give me a message that was not just grievance, but hope. difficulty that comes with telling a story like this is it treats black life almost like an unending barrage of suffering, only meant to bring empathy. And that part is easy to articulate, but the part that you probably wouldn't understand unless you grew up there is how much I actually love my neighborhood, how much fun we actually had there. One of my favorite memories as a kid is we beat these drug dealers in basketball. We were in middle school at the time. And so we had this place called Hollow Park where they had chain nets. I don't know if you ever heard chain nets, but we used to make the shot and say cash money, which sounded like a cash register. And the chain nets were only ever up for like a week or two before someone stole them. I don't know what they did with them, but they would just take the chain nets. But you had like the first 2 or 3 weeks of spring, you had chain nets. It wasn't, it was summer, wasn't too hot, it was doable. So we were out there playing on the chain nets, and these drug dealers came up. You can tell they were drug dealers, we knew them. And you could never tell what kind of mood a drug dealer is going to be in, but they were friendly this day. And they had a cooler with like beer and wine coolers and brown liquor. They had a lot of, they came to enjoy themselves. They decided they wanted to play basketball. And I don't know, they didn't know that, they were from Alabama, but it gets hot around noon. And so they had consumed a significant amount of alcohol as the temperature continued to rise. We in middle school weren't drinking alcohol. So as they got drunk, our middle school energy got better and we won the game. They're like stumbling around, sitting on it, and it was just like the most fun we ever had. But those were the same people who sold the drugs that ruined our community. But when you lived there, you saw that those people weren't just one thing. They could be kind or they could be cruel. And the reason that you have patience with broken people is because you never know if that kindness might not win out in the end. If you pause my story when I'm 16 years old and I die in the drive-by that happened in my neighborhood, they would have said, he's just another young black kid who hung out with the wrong people. But because I had time, I was able to make something of myself. It is precisely the damaged people who need time. My grandmother, Sophie, I'm going to stop talking after this. My grandmother, Sophie, great-grandmother, Sophie, was also tenant farmer, picked cotton, illiterate, didn't know how to read, so she only marked her name with an X throughout most of her life. But she picked cotton during the day, she cleaned houses in the evening, and she was a midwife, brought little black babies into the world. And she managed to save up enough money as an illiterate black woman to buy a plot of land, her own vine and fig tree, where my father was born, where I was actually raised. She married a man, and they had built a nice life together. They had the nicest car in the neighborhood. He was a minister. His name was Gus. Actually, it was Gus. And one day, later on, Sophia, she ages, she has a bunch of kids. She gives the land over to my grandmother. My grandmother is taking care of Sophia. That's when I move onto the property. And my grandfather, Gus, comes home one day, and he didn't realize there had been a fire that had been started earlier, so he wanted to put a little kerosene to get the fire going to warm the house up. But there was embers that he didn't see, and the fire leaps up, and the house is quickly aflame. And there were 2 twin boys, 2 years old, who on the other side of that wall of fire that he couldn't save. That fire destroys that house. And so my grandmother takes out a loan to a white family, the family that had sold them the property. No one knows the terms of that loan. But she makes payments starting in 1968, I think the year is. Year after year after year, after year after year after year, passes down to the next member of my family. She eventually has a stroke in the early 2000s. and she dies. But because we never knew the terms of that loan, that land that my great-grandmother bought reverted back to the Wright family. And land that had been in my family for 2 generations was stolen from us. You can actually go back there now. I went there after I finished this book. It lies in ruins. What actually happens to it is that the family that owns it dies and gives it to a church. Now you can hear that story and think of it simply as a tragedy, but actually find some beauty in it, because this black woman started from nothing, and she bought some land. And I spent 3 years on that land as a kid. I remember playing there. And my family's loss of that land is not a failure of us. It's a failure of America. My father was actually born in the aftermath of that fire. He was born 2 years later. Him and his brother Stephen were meant to be a replacement for the 2 kids who had burned up in that fire. As a result of that fire, my grandfather becomes an alcoholic, and he takes out his grief on my dad. Anything that my dad did wrong, I found this out after he was dead, was judged off of what those 2 boys would have become. And so he was told that he was a loser or a failure or doomed to cause everyone in his family pain. I realized that sometimes the people who we think of as monsters are actually just broken. And this consistent return was him trying to be the man that he knew that he should be. Towards the end of my father's life, he actually finally gets clean. And he sits down with me, and we have a conversation. And I asked him, Dad, why did you leave? I thought it would be like the movies where there'd be this big moment. But he said, son, I don't rightly know. And we were stuck in this moment of silence. Then he said to me, he said, son, I'm back in church. Actually, I've been going to this church in Dallas. Pastor, their name is Tony Evans. And I said, I know Tony. And that was the beginning of not actually a friendship. It was too late for that. It was, we were trying to get close to each other. We didn't know how to do it. The day that he died, he had called my mom. She was going into a movie with her sister, and he had been trying to win her back. Like, baby, I'm going to get you back, Mom. Ain't nobody thinking about you, boy. And he said to her, all I can do is pray. Mom thought that was odd, but she just hung the phone up. And he was dead 5 minutes later. He was on his way home, but he ran out of road. But I want to suggest that that attempt to return home, even if it fails, has its own beauty. There's something of God in it. And there's something of God in the story of Sophia. There's something of God in the story of Wavon. There's something of the story of God even in Jesse's death. There's a beauty there in the journey itself, even if they don't arrive. So in the midst of trying to find out about my father's story and make sense of it, I did, in the end, find God in my father's story. I found God even in the struggles of my ancestors over those 4 generations. And through doing all of those things in a deeper and more profound way, I found God in my own story. And in that finding, I was welcomed into the grand story that is marked by beauty emerging out of places of death. Empty tombs, still speak volumes. Thank you.
Let me welcome to our stage the rest of the panelists, Jaquan Smith and Professors Teresa Cosby and Honore Rice. And while they're coming up, I want to introduce them to you. I'm going to start with Teresa Cosby, who is coming this way. She is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Furman, where she teaches constitutional law. She earned both her BA and JD at Howard University. Before joining the faculty at Furman, Professor Cosby clerked for United States Magistrate Judge William M. Cato. Yeah, that's right. It's not spelled that way. Junior. And served as Assistant Deputy Attorney General for the South Carolina Attorney General's Office. Was the Executive Director of Legal Services of South Carolina and the former Legal Services of Western Carolina. She has also served as the Executive Director of the Black Family Land Trust, a 6-state program. Honore Rice is Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience and Department Chair of Neuroscience at Furman. Honore was born and raised in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He earned his BS at Wofford. Sorry, football players. That's a hard word to take right now. And MA and PhD at Stony Brook University. The author of many professional articles, Honore's primary program of research investigates the underlying brain mechanisms involved in the rewarding properties of drugs of abuse, which seems to be relevant tonight. Jaquan Smith is a junior health science pre-med major from Augusta, Georgia. Yeah, you guys can clap. Yeah, I know it. He's a redshirt sophomore football running back who in 2023 had 32 rushes for 144 yards and 2 touchdowns before being sidelined with a season-ending knee injury. And we miss him this year. And the coolest thing about Jaquan is he was named to the 2024 Southern Conference Academic Honor Roll. That is a big one. Let's give our panelists a warm welcome. So I've asked each of the panelists who have been listening to Esau, and some have looked at his book and things like that, how do you react to his story, and perhaps reflecting on your own story as you've listened to this one. So, Teresa, I'm going to start with you. Do you mind? Well, we're the closest, and so, I wanted to make sure she had all the time. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, do we need a mic?
Yeah, we probably could use that. Hello.
Thank you, Brent. So when you were telling your story, I started to think about a statement that Michael Dawson makes about the black scholar. And one of the statements he makes is that the black scholar doesn't get to live in the tower. And so you start off with that the black scholar doesn't have that convenience. And hence you have to be a scholar advocate. And so you ignored your committee and your mentor's advice and became this advocate. But then as you continue to tell your story, I started to think about all of the black scholars and the titles of some of their most important works and how your story resonated with these titles. So I'll mention one of my favorites is Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk and Living Behind the Veil. And then there's Randall Kennedy, The Persistence of the Color Line. And then I went back to, then I thought about Cornel West and Race Matters. And then I went back to Dawson, and when Dawson introduced this term called linked fate. And linked fate is this idea that because black people share a history in America, is we don't know our continent, so we don't get to say we're hyphenated American. that since we have this linked faith and this shared history, that we have a communal relationship with each other. And so Dawson is a political scientist, so he's trying to figure out why people vote the way they vote. That's the question he's getting to. But he explains this communal relationship that wherein we don't think individually, we think of the community when we act. And so that was resonating in your story that you were telling. And then when you talked about the church, and you talked about a place of safety and peace, that's one of the only areas in which the black people could congregate and feel safe and feel peace because you weren't threatened by intrusion from someone else. And so these are the kind of things that are resonating with me. And even when you go back to think about linked faith, and I look at this panel, I'm a boomer. Dr. Rice is X, right? You're a millennial?
I don't know, I'm 45. What does that put me? I'm on the
You're on the edge. You might be.
We're ex-millennials, they put us in between.
Okay. And even among generations, we still kind of have this communal relationship with each other. And so specifically a story about me as a boomer, I went to segregated schools. I integrated into white schools in the 6th grade. And it wasn't just an idea that they didn't want us. We also didn't want to go. That's the story. And when we went, we felt a sense of loss because everything about our culture and our community was taken away. We had to go to white schools and they kept their names. If they used our buildings, they changed the names of the buildings of our school. One of the things I loved to do, I was in elementary school and we used to have spring celebration. And we would have this activity called May Day. And during May Day, we would plant a maypole. And we would wear the coordinated colors with the ribbon on the maypoles. If you've ever seen a maypole be planted. And we would get some Motown song that we would develop a dance routine to. And we would dance planting the maypole. And that would migrate up through the high school. So the higher up you got, the more sophisticated those dances got with the maypole. And when we integrated, we lost that. We lost our black bands. We lost our cheerleaders. We lost our schools. So for us, integration was a loss. And it even resonates today when we talk about that. So when I was looking for a college to go to, I was looking to capture some of that back. I was also looking for the opportunity to not be a black student. I wanted to just be a student. I wanted to revert to that status that I had enjoyed in a segregated school, because in my segregated school, I was happy. In my segregated community, I was happy. Because what our parents did was they went out, we stayed in. We lived in a bubble. So we didn't run into white people on a regular basis. So we were kind of insulated in some way from the trauma of racism. But when we integrated out, we were hit with the trauma of racism. So when I was looking for a college, I was looking for a respite. And that's why I went to Howard University. But it was when you get to Howard University, and I'm a Southern black girl from Mobile, South Carolina. I went to a high school named James F. Burns High School. If you're a historian, you kind of know. The flag was the Confederate flag. The mascot was a rebel soldier. And so this is where I went to school. So when I get to Howard, I'm just amazed that all these black scholars exist in one place. And all of these black students exist in one place. But we are not homogeneous. We are very heterogeneous. We're from the West Coast, New York people who thought they were better than everybody else. Philly, Maryland, Africa. And so there is this homogeneity that did not exist, but yet still we're connected in a way that can only be explained by our race, and a race that draws us together because the race is threatened. Because what Michael Dawson talks about is root threat. And that also creates linked faith. And since your group is threatened, you're linked tighter together. And so when you're talking, it's all resonating.
Yeah.
It's all resonating. You're telling that story.
One of the things that was really,
Yeah. It's so much that you said. One of the things that was so helpful one of the things that was transformative to me when I sat down and talked to my family, and they began to tell me stories about integration. I knew it, but it didn't really. It became flesh when you read about these events. So Brown versus Board of Education, integration happened, America changed, but it doesn't actually. And so what history books do, they actually distort the experience when people go through history. And it makes it seem like these things don't have any echoes. And so listening to my mom tell her stories about what it was like in integration, I saw the long tail of history in my family story. I'll just say one other thing, and I won't respond to all of it, but when I was working on Reading While Black, I actually wanted to title it, the first title, I'm really bad at choosing titles, but the first title was called The New Testament and the Souls of Black Folks. But I said, you don't come for WB. Like, you don't know Boca unless you know, I don't want any of that smoke. And so, but like that book was actually one of the books that was, and some of the ones that you mentioned were the books that were in the back of my head when I was working on it, because I've been influenced with those same people. So yes, Souls of Black Folk, the problem of 21st, whatever century, the problem of the color, double consciousness, all of those things were influenced some of the work. And that was actually the working title. But I said, let me get away from that. Because I don't want people thinking I'm WEB. I didn't want any of that. So, but he is one of my heroes.
Pass it on to Monterey. You're next.
So, since we're talking about books, to your book and Ta-Nehisi's book, both resonated with me being now a father of two Black males. And so I wanted to first just say thank you for your book. I'm reading it, it's really great. Listening to your story is great. For me, there's a couple of themes that we think about, and that is things of being is complicated. Relationships are complicated, families are complicated. Coming up in the South as a Black male is complicated. Trying to figure out who you are is complicated. Trying to figure out where to be a safe place, as you mentioned, is complicated. And one of the things you said in your book early on in your introduction that I found myself struggling with, that I was glad that you brought up, and that was, you were at a talk or somewhere and they asked you, what was one of the most racist things you had ever experienced?
Yeah.
And instead of answering that question, you asked to move on. But you said, and I'm paraphrasing, it's not exactly what you said, but it was, it was like each time you had to do this was like opening up your veins, bleeding in front of everyone, and living out your pain publicly. And so that resonated with me because that actually has been part of the reason why I've adapted some of the things that I've adapted. So keeping things superficial, talking about things that doesn't allow you to really go in depth in fear of how people might truly reveal themselves to you and the trauma that you have. And so I understand that from that perspective, and for me,
And I wrote a book anyway.
you wrote it. But for those of us reading it who are also like you, your story is very similar. I grew up in the South. I went to Wheaton College, and for me, the challenges that I have is simply thinking about where can you be safe, right? Where is this safe space? Can you allow people to know you truly? And then now, you mentioned about driving. I have a 16-year-old boy who I have to now tell him that same story that you talked about.
My son got his license today.
Okay, mine last week.
Praying for America.
And so we're still having these stories, right? One quick story about me though, just for students who may get an opportunity to speak with me, is that I ended up at Wofford because I grew up in public housing and we were very broke. Drugs and all of that ravaged my household too. But I got, from Spartanburg High School, they told me, a lady, she said, look, you might have some potential. You have 4 opportunities. We'll pay for 4 applications for you to go to college. Oh, okay, great, because I couldn't afford the applications. And so I chose 3. Everyone, in South Carolina, I knew nothing. South Carolina, Clemson, but I knew Morehouse. And so that was the 3rd. The 4th one she said to me was, I didn't have one. She said, well, why don't you choose somewhere in Spartanburg, since that's where I'm from. And she said, I said, okay, well, I had heard about Wofford, can I apply to Wofford? She said, no. She said, you probably won't get into Wofford. You probably won't be able to do that. She said, why don't you apply to SMC? And at that time, it was a 2-year school. And nothing against SMC or anything like that, but I thought, well, if it's free, I'm going to apply to what I perceive to be the best school in Spartanburg. And so I did that. But what that said to me was that you had already made some judgments about what my limitations should be. But I applied, got in, they gave me the most money, so that's where it is. But I remember leaving South Carolina, something you said tonight, and I said, I'm not ever coming back to South Carolina. I said, I will never come back to South Carolina because going to Wofford, being a minority black male, and the things that I had to deal with at that school, I oftentimes felt like I had to open myself up and bleed in front of everyone without any type of, without any empathy. And that was very tough for me. So anyway, it's not about me, but I just want to let you know that your story resonated so well with me, and I wanted to take the opportunity to kind of share some common thread there.
One of the things that I had to think about is, what do you do with a microphone? This might seem like a strange question to ask, but I had this column with the New York Times, and I had these opportunities. And people wanted to hear like the hero's journey, where like the black kid who grows up and he sees all of this stuff, and because of their grit, they kind of overcome. And you couldn't turn away from it, like you had it. And so it's almost like this unescapable thing. So I had this idea. Yeah, I'll tell you a story, but I'm going to tell you a story that you won't be able to tell. And what I wanted to be able to tell was the entire story, not just a piece of it. So was there anti-black racism? Yes, there was. Was there violence? Yes, there was. How does the violence come? If you read the book, talk about the economic flight that leads to the crime that's in that community. So yes, there's violence. Where does that violence come from? But yes, there's also family trauma. Yes, there's the religious question. And so the only way that I could talk about one aspect of the pain was to connect it to everything else. So that I felt like I was not performing, but I was empowering. So in other words, I have to live the rest of my life knowing that Jesse McCourt existed, and he died before we went to go to college. Now everybody who reads this book has to know about Jesse too. And so if you want to know why I care about the things that I care about, because I promised never to forget Jesse, right? Or my grandmother, they stole her land. Are we comfortable in an America like that? And so for me, the only way to kind of to take back my story was to rip it out of the kind of simplistic place they put it in, and to put it in a context where we make sense, so that everybody can meet all the people who shape me, because I'm a product of that neighborhood. And so when I stand on the stage and speak, you're hearing all of the best of Northwest Huntsville. Not me, but what they pour into me, the deacons, the mothers in the church, and football coaches, and all those other people. And so that's what I thought I was doing with the story. And so for me, that's a much more empowering story than just you tell me this bad thing that happened to you to create empathy. I wanted to create this wider narrative, so I'm glad that it resonated. And I wanted to even say this thing about, like, and hopefully I was not trying to say anything negative about Ta-Nehisi Coates, but there's been a variety of ways of responding to anti-black racism and trauma, and there's always been a strand of almost atheism as protest against anti-black racism. This is the guy who really wanted nothing to do with it, and seeing the hypocrisy that existed in the American church. And so I wasn't trying to say that like there is this, I was trying to be meaning. I was trying to say a lot of my literary heroes, even Du Bois, have an interesting relationship with religion, or their relationship with religion. And so I couldn't, in my own narrative, write about race in America without including the religious aspect, given the complicated relationship some of the African Americans have with religion. And so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't, if it seemed flippant, I wasn't trying to be flippant. I want to get that.
Pass it down to Jay Horn.
Thank you. I have a little bit of a more softer story. At an FCA event we had 2 weeks ago, we talked about how the speaker talked about, he's a pastor at a church around here, like an early impoverished area, and he talked about how we do more softer testimonies. That kind of resonated with me because I have more of a softer testimony, but not in short of God's grace for our family. Where I come from Augusta, Georgia, back then it's probably 80%, 90% black. So I was kind of more in a bubble like Ms. Cosby talked about. I was more like sheltered in a bubble. We never experienced more any racism. And the white wouldn't have that. So, but you know, a lot of things about our family, like, and Augusta, like in your book talking about Mr. McCaulley, like the mindset of black kids growing up in America. And we had that definitely in middle school. I went to all black school. I was in high school. My dad had a job and we went to all that area. I'll get into that later, but for growing up black in America, in Augusta, Georgia, we had 3 mindsets as a middle schooler, which my parents really fought against. So it's like, either you become an athlete, become a teacher, or you become a drug dealer. And my family was not like far from that at all. My uncles, yeah, maybe, but some of the school kids like had that mindset. We all had that mindset. We didn't talk about it, but like it's always like in our DNA. Like we know one of us probably won't make it to college. Yeah. And so my parents fought against that. That we didn't talk about it at all. My parents were very like sheltered. They didn't talk about racism. We didn't deal with it a lot, so they didn't talk about it. But like they knew that was the case for us growing up there. So they fought against me like getting my education in like more than sports. Like I'm one of those kids that grew up on my grandmas and aunties and uncles and granddads' Facebook saying like, look at my son score 6 touchdowns a day in like 5th grade, 6th grade. Like I'm being like a little star boy. And my parents didn't care for none of that. Like my dad, I love my dad. He's my hero. And like he said, you're good at football, but like, how about school though? Like he said, you're gonna make it college regardless of what happens. And I like how your mom prayed for you after you were in. Like that resonated with me hard. Like you might have a big time injury in high school. And like so I remember coming home some days like when I'm going back to school, all my friends don't care about school and they're just like lollygagging in the bathrooms or like in the gym shooting basketballs, not trying as hard as I am in school. And just come home upset, like I'm tired of trying. Like, Mom, why you owe me so much? And she's like, it's important. Like you might not know it now, but it's really important. It's like I had you locked in school. I just didn't care. My neighborhood friends, like they didn't care about school. Most of them came from one-parent houses. I was fortunate to have 2 of my parents with me. And my parents, I found out why my parents were like that. None of my parents went to actual like college. They got together early in high school and had my older brother, whose birthday is today. And he turned 25 today. And they got me in high school, had my brother in an accident, and they never got to finish school. They finished high school. My mom didn't finish high school, my dad finished high school. And he went to trade school. So none of us got to actually experience like a college education and actually use our brains into it. And they definitely like despised them that do that. So they integrated into our family. And now because of that, my brother was the first person in our generation to actually go to college and get a degree at the school of Georgia, University of Georgia. And that was a really big deal for us. And then I ended up being the first person in our family to get a Division I scholarship ever. So my family was like on the money, like all aunties and uncles were like.
You like me, you start being second.
Yeah.
My older sisters are saying.
Yeah. And it was very rejuvenating for our family to see something like that. A lot of families didn't go to college either. They either went to the army or I don't know how they got the money, honestly. But so it was very rejuvenating to see that. And I always appreciate my mom and dad for giving me that like work ethic for sure. And I also like I do it because a lot of my friends didn't have the same parenting I had. My parents weren't religious. They sent me off my grandma a lot to learn about her. And before I moved to all white school, I wasn't really upset about the fact that I'm going to all white school. I was more upset about the racism I feel. I was more upset about like the lack of like culture I was going to be with. Like you talked about, like I was gonna miss the prep rallies. I was gonna miss like game day, saying stuff to your boys. I was gonna miss like all of that. Like fried chicken Friday sometimes. Like they pop that. I was gonna miss. Like I was more scared of racism, more scared of like how lonely I was gonna be. And growing up in Augusta, like the school system's all right, but we have I think we have 13, 12 schools all in a 5-mile radius dang near, so there's not a lot of money going to each school. So we're all very small population and not a lot of money there for books and teachers. And that's one of the biggest things. I never had a teacher that like smiled at us every day for these 5 days in a week. And we thought it was normal, like they just here, like we're just here, no one cares about school anyway. And they didn't really like the job. But then I moved to my all-white school, and teachers were like fighting, like smiling. The first day I came home, my mom asked why I was so tired. And I was just like, I never smiled so much to teachers ever in my life. Because we ain't used to smiling to teachers, and they were like, ask all this question, like, where are you from? Like, I'm not used to getting asked this question from an adult. I'm not used to talking to adults. They won't, like, in Augusta, like the way we're, like a black mom and dad's raised you don't question adults. The adults will talk to you really like you're a kid, you say this place. Kids table, basically. But at this new white high school, like, they actually asked me, like, what do you care about? Like, something like that. And I thought, that's when I saw this, how different it was. And I was like, why is it like this? Like, what's the difference? Like, why are y'all happy to be here? And people that are from not happy to be here. And why can't they experience this? Like, in the football games, like, we had a lot more people at the football games too. Like, so we had 13 schools in Augusta, so nobody really came to all the games, like a big crowd, unless you like go on state that year, which we rarely did. And so I was like, I felt bad. My people back home, I could tell them like how good the school is. Like, I was like, education's good. Like, they gave me all these new football gear. They gave me cleats. Like, back in Augusta, you had to buy your own cleats, your own helmet, stuff like that. And this new school gave me all that stuff. So I just felt bad, like, why can't they experience this? Like, and we're getting recruited at Augusta either. Like, I moved to Galatians, Georgia, which is near Beaufort, Georgia. It's almost near Atlanta. And they were getting recruited like they're supposed to either because nobody goes to games. So I just felt bad how different the culture is here. Like, why can't they experience this too? So that's why always one of my goals is like, I want to make Augusta the best place in Georgia. Like, if God ever gives me enough like grace and equip me with the ability to do that, I always want to do that. Because like, I have a lot of friends still there. They didn't go to school. Now they're like electricians, which is good on them. I'm glad they found their way. But like, I always thought there's always somewhere we didn't get to like show our promise or our skill. I always kind of regret that. And I just always like thank God for that, especially like how different my life turned out to be. Not saying it's better than theirs. Like, we're all sinners at the end of the day. But I always thought that was always like, why? Why did you choose Inside Field? It could have been anybody that got recruited to play Division I football. Like, so I always thought it was huge, and like, and hopefully my little brother, I have a little brother too. His birthday was last month. He turned 13, and now my new goal is like, to like, I guess, be the best role model I can be for him. So yeah, that's most of my story.
Thank you, all of you.
I would say, I gave Coach a hard time. I'm actually not sure that Coach was the one who stopped recruiting me. Furman either recruited me before or after I got injured, so they actually could have been the people who came later. So don't be mean to
Coach Hendricks is off the hook now. It was you.
So I was going to say that I think that you're right about what long-term exposure to debilitating poverty can do to teachers. Because you see so many students who have promise not make it, and some teachers protect themselves by hardening themselves, and hope is hard to come by. And so I think that what you probably experienced in Augusta were teachers most teachers don't start out that way. They start out with the desire to go back to these communities to do some good. It's funny you talk about it, and then I know we gotta do it in open. I want to go back to my hometown, just like you did. And one of the things that I do regret, like the reason how Public Promise is restored all of that, I didn't make it back. History just took me in another direction. But I know exactly what it means for the responsibility to a place. And so I'm pretty sure Mama told you the same thing, where you came from. And so that responsibility that you have is important. One of the other reason that I wrote this book is that when you grow up in poverty, you're connected to those people. And there's a sense of responsibility. And one of the things that's been interesting about having kids, they didn't grow up that way. And that's not the goal, right? You want your kids to have a different experience than you had. That's the goal. But they're not organically connected to impoverished communities. Like, they can visit it, but it's like, one of the things that I've tried to do in my writing is for the people who weren't there, is to connect them to those places. So the responsibility that you feel, and that you feel, that you feel, that I feel, other people might be able to feel too. So don't lose that. That's my only thing I'll say. I know you, okay, Q&A?
Hey, yeah, we're gonna do that. I just want to recognize Claire down here. He keeps mentioning
I'm
his
sorry,
daughter.
my
She's
daughter- my daughter's
sitting
sitting
right
right
here.
here.
Claire's right here. And, she's got a few years yet. We hope she'll be sitting out here somewhere, getting her own CLP.
I am past my limit of how many trips I've taken in here. And so I said I will add a trip here if I could bring my daughter along. And so,
We loved it.
so and she's here. She's probably gonna be mad that I mentioned that.
All right, questions from the audience. Yeah, Brian.
Dr. McCaulley, thank you
Yeah.
for being here tonight, and to Claire. And this is a little bit of a selfish question because I'm a pastor, but
Yeah.
So early on in Reading While Black, I love this thing you said about what I'm trying to do is be like Jacob and grab the text
Yeah.
and not let it go until it blesses me or us, and having what you call a hermeneutic of trust.
Yeah.
And you also talked about, just in your schooling, hearing other approaches to Scripture
Yeah.
and challenges to a hermeneutic of trust.
Yeah.
And so I've never gotten to meet you or hear you. I met you on the way in, but I've never gotten to hear you. And that came through loud and clear, even though you weren't verbalizing that or explaining it. I just thought it was all through what you said, even the way you interpreted the loss of your family land and ending on a note of resurrection. I heard that hermeneutic of trust. And I just wanted to ask, what locked that in for you? I mean, was that like unbroken from being a church young man but a believing mom, or was there a point where that just galvanized?
I think that people don't really, so nihilism, okay, I don't want to say this, I'll try to be brief. One of the things is when you go to college and you read books, which I hope you all do, and you reflect on issues like the problem of evil and anti-black racism and slavery and Jim Crow, and those call for religious and spiritual questions. And you listen to people who can articulate this in very erudite language. But I had an actual great-grandmother named Sophia, who I knew, who didn't write about those things with the same eloquence. She couldn't write at all, but she experienced it, and she talked about it. And she explained it to me, how she made it through. The same thing that my grandmother said. And so, just because they didn't have degrees, it didn't mean they didn't have a wisdom of their own. And so what I want to say is I had to take seriously my great-grandmother's prayers and her faith and not dismiss it as like sub-intellectual, because she actually wrestled with God when that was all that she had. And so in some ways, I thought there was a wisdom there. And maybe it's like my own rebellious nature. And I'll try to say this as briefly as I can, because you never understand what I mean by this. Is when I was at school, I felt like my white professor was telling me to trust them. Right? They knew the truth about religion. And I was like, and they were mad. They were rightfully mad at like kind of the racist, fundamentalist, segregation and stuff. That was like their enemy. And that was true. That was the religion they were battling against. But I never knew that God. I never knew that religion. The only religion I knew was the religion of my grandmother and my great-grandmother. That was the faith that I was a part of. And the criticism of the fundamentalists they were mad about did not match the description of the faith my grandmother taught me. So I felt like, in some sense, I wanted to be able to find a way of being Christian in America that didn't involve me choosing sides in a fight that had nothing to do with it. And when I think I said it in the book, and it was actually true. Shout out to David Hume, but Frederick Douglass spoke to my heart more than David Hume did. And when I read Frederick Douglass, I read someone who I could see myself in. And Fred sounded like people that I call him Fred because he Friends sounded like people who I knew, and these other people didn't. And so for me, it was more, and then we don't have the language to talk about this, but philosophical nihilism, or like nihilism, is that, we're all gonna die, the end justifies the means to get whatever you want. All of these things were things that were actually available in Black communities. We didn't call it nihilism, but fatalism that says none of this matters, that the system is broken, therefore I'm gonna take what I can get at the expense of other people, right? I saw that way of being in the world. They didn't call it nihilism, they didn't call it utilitarian ethics, but that's actually what it was. And actually saw the unfolding of utilitarian ethics, the ends justify the means, get what you want, there is no great. I saw that in the lives of people, and I saw its implications. And so what school did was give me words to say, oh, you're a nihilist. Oh, you're like kind of a nationalist. And so like for me, I found hope as a way of being a person in the world that didn't just end up with a bunch of grievances. And so for me, hope was the only thing that seemed like something that I could use as a guide through life, that I could then pass on to my kids, that I could then think might be useful in the world.
We want to go on longer, at least some of us do, but we're going to have to wrap it up right here. And give me 1 minute before I dismiss you all, because I want to talk about tomorrow night. As we wrap up this evening, let me invite you to 2 events tomorrow. First, if you are a member of the Furman community, define that broadly, you are welcome to join us in the politics department tomorrow at 12:30 for tacos in Tocqueville. Come and eat free tacos and join in a more informal conversation with Professor McCaulley. Second, please come tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. over at Harkness Pavilion for part 2 of the Black Experience in America. Tomorrow's event is co-sponsored by On Discourse and will focus on American patriotism. Professor McCaulley, Marion Strobel of the History Department, and Akan Malichi of the Politics and International Affairs Department will each outline their different views of patriotism. And by the way, if you read the New York Times on July 4th, you read Professor McCaulley's really good column on patriotism from a Black man's perspective. And that's what we'll be talking about. The audience will then discuss these perspectives in small groups under the supervision of trained facilitators. It should be an excellent way for students and others to speak across their differences in constructive and healthy ways, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Now let's show our appreciation to our panelists.